maps you've used in your working lives or in your own life. So I want to leave a bit of time for that. And we're also going to give some of you a chance to make your own map this afternoon. So you can think about that later on. So before I begin, in the corner, if you have a chance before you go home today, in the corner there's several maps from various people in the room that have brought them. Please take some time to look at them if you wish. You see the map that has some dots on it? Might be a little hard to see from where you're sitting in the left-hand corner. That's actually James's wife Karen is a very avid canoeist. She loves to go canoeing. And each of those dots is a canoe location where you can go and put your canoe in the water, go for a trip, and then come back again in the same day. And you'll see some little slips of paper that Karen brought in too that you can take home with you, and it has a link to a website where you can find out information about all those canoeing sites. So if you like camping and canoeing, that's a very good mapping resource that Karen and her group have produced. So feel free to take a look at that. The other maps, I know Grace brought some maps. There's Grace. A couple of atlases, right, yeah. Grace? One is an old atlas that a person from our church called Sylvia Hepburn, who was over 100 years old when she died a few years ago. Sylvia had this atlas, and she knew Grace really liked maps, so Sylvia gave the atlas to Grace. And Grace says to this day, when she's looking up a little tiny place somewhere in Canada, that old atlas of Sylvia's is still the best one to find them, right, Grace?
Yeah. Tiny town, yeah.
What was your mom's town?
Keys.
K-E-Y-E-S?
K-E-Y-E-S.
Little town in Manitoba where Grace's mom was born.
Grace not in any other map.
Not in any other maps or atlases. Grace found that little tiny place called Keys in Sylvia's old atlas. So I think it's a red colored atlas. So you'll see some books and some globes, and don't hesitate if you want to take a look afterwards. And I've got a little sheet there that has some references to some of the maps you'll be looking at this afternoon if you want to find them yourself later, and some books. And finally, there's kind of a strange looking picture up there on the right. Can you see that picture in blue and yellow and green? We have a grandson named Asher, and he's about 8 years old. He lives a long way away in Australia, but when we were down visiting him last month, he made that map. So you can take a look at Asher's map. Might not be quite to scale, might be a few, but that's his map. And I think maybe that's part of the message too. There's always maps have there's some choices involved when people make maps. No map is completely right or completely including everything, completely detailed. There's always some choices you have to make when you're making a map. So Asher made some choices when he made his map, and we all do. Even the maps you see that are published, there are always choices involved in making those, so just keep that in mind. But I've gone on a long way before I get started here, but Brenda's been good enough to help a lot with this presentation. And can anybody guess what we're looking at? That's a map. It happens to be a map that's changing. Can anybody guess what the map is showing?
Airflow.
Very good, Jill. Those are airplanes. How did you know? Jill, how did you know?
It looks like the background of the weather report.
Yes. But it's actually air flights. And so can you see the shadow moving across the earth?
Yes.
That's nighttime coming. So as nighttime comes, you'll see the flights decrease.
Mm-hmm.
And then as the daylight starts, you'll see them going from, I guess, east to west. You see the pattern there. Flowing from Europe. You can see Europe and North America. It's a world map. And it's a 24-hour map of airplane flights. Maybe I'll just loop through here again. We'll look at it one more time.
I like it so far.
We always look to see what flights are going to Australia, because that's where we went last month. But you can see all the traffic in North America, but as nighttime comes, it starts to decrease.
So they don't fly at night? What about when we go from Ottawa to, say, Rome or something? It's usually a night flight.
I remember asking a pilot about that just in our last flight, and he said usually there's no absolute bylaws or rules about flying at night. Planes can usually fly at night, but normally most airports try to reduce the quantity of flights because it's noisy for people trying to sleep. But there's usually no international law that says you can't fly after a certain time. But anyway, that's just, you can find that map on the internet too. But what I wanted to say about this map, the first time I saw a map like that was right after 9/11. So you remember during 9/11, all the flights were shut down, and many of them went to Gander, Newfoundland. We worked in a mapping office with the federal government, and this group from, I think it was the Federal Aviation Authority, came to talk to us about mapping. And they showed us, I'm sure they weren't showing this to everybody, but they showed us a map like that of what happened during the day of 9/11. And two things stood out in my mind when I saw the pattern. One, same kind of thing as this, but when 9/11 happened, all of a sudden the traffic stopped.
Oh, wow.
But before that, and you can see some of the traffic going to Gander, Newfoundland. Gander's way up, top left corner there. The other thing I noticed before everything shut down was a pattern that happened. Somebody asked about late at night flights. There was a lot of traffic coming into a place in the southeastern corner of the United States about 2 o'clock in the morning, and then going out from there again at 2 o'clock in the morning, or a little later. Can you guess what that pattern was? In the middle of the night, all these planes were coming into, I think it was actually Atlanta, Georgia, and then leaving again a few hours later. Any idea?
Air Force fighters?
Good suggestion. It wasn't military.
Was it?
FedEx.
FedEx.
FedEx has a big hub in Atlanta, and jets from all over North America, maybe all over the world, I don't know. They're bringing in parcels during the day. So every parcel, if I send a parcel by FedEx from here to Yellowknife, it's going to go through, believe it or not, it's going to go through Atlanta, Georgia. It all goes there. They sort everything out, and then the jets take off again at some weird hour in the morning to fly the packages out for the next day. So sometimes, all I'm saying is sometimes in these maps aren't always static. These are static maps, snapshot, but maps these days, people are interested in how are things changing. And that was an example of a pattern I saw with FedEx that I had no idea that was happening that way, but that's the way they get their parcels delivered. So that was just sort of an introduction. Brendan and I wanted to put something at the beginning so we wouldn't have to interrupt the rest of the slides with that video, but you can find that on your computer if you want to take a look at that picture. What I'm going to try to do is tell you some stories that are really about my experiences growing up with maps, growing up as a boy when I started to work, and then also a little bit of history of where mapping came from, and then finally some more modern maps for you to look at. But it's just my story, it's just my experiences. I'm sure you all have different experiences that sometimes overlap with mine, but I'm sure many of you have experiences I've never run into with mapping. So don't consider this as the end all, be all about mapping. It's just my ways I interacted with maps through growing up and working. So will we get started, Brenda? I'll hold that. On the right? Okay, thank you. Would it help? Thanks, Marcia.
I'm gonna turn off the light.
Yeah, okay.
If people stay put.
A little clearer? Okay. Can you hear me okay at the back?
Yes.
Not bad? Okay. For some reason, I like this picture. Does anybody know?
Christopher Columbus or?
About the same time. This picture is just called The Geographer. And it was painted by somebody called Vermeer. Antoine or Antony Vermeer. 1600s in Holland, I think.
Yeah.
I just liked it because I thought it gave a good impression of what a geographer was like. I took geography at school, so in some ways I didn't grow up thinking I wanted to be a geographer. But I think as time went on, maybe other options narrowed down, things I realized I couldn't do. But I think it was mostly a geographer. They're almost like a jack of all trades. We know a little bit about a lot of different subjects, but we don't know very much detail about anything in particular. So in some ways it's hard for geographers to get jobs, but maybe after we get a job, we have an opportunity to learn a little bit about different aspects of the job and contribute that way. But this is a geographer many, many years ago, and I just liked that impression, and it sort of suited me. I guess I found that I was more of a generalist, so geography really appealed to me because every map is different. Every map can be a different subject. We think of maps sometimes just as road maps, and I'm sure all of you are familiar with Google Maps from your phones or from your car. Can you guess how many Google Maps sessions happen on a typical month? Can you guess how many people would make a Google Map in a month? Not just an individual map, but a session. So if you're driving somewhere, that would count as one session. Any idea how many Google Maps would be made every month? Dale?
Billions.
A billion is the number I remember. Maybe there's more than that. So many people are familiar with road maps that way, and we were familiar with road maps before as paper maps. But what I hope to show you today is there's so many more different types of maps than just road maps. Not saying road maps aren't important, they're very important, but just before we leave Google Maps, somebody was asking today is there ever any mistakes in Google Maps?
Yes.
I didn't have to ask you the question, I guess. The example I remember is I have a friend, a boyhood friend who lives out by Woodruff and Prince of Wales, that intersection. That used to be a throughway. You could drive down Woodruff Avenue and go right onto Prince of Wales to go down towards Brockville. At one point, there was a lot of accidents, and at one point, they physically blocked Woodruff Avenue as it joined Prince of Wales. For months, maybe even years after that, Google Maps didn't happen to be updated. Trent said he'd get a dozen people every day stopping to say, how come we can't go through and get on Prince of Wales? So it's so important that maps be kept up to date, and even Google, with all of its resources, it's a big challenge for them sometimes. So maybe that's another point about maps. Are maps always right? No. And I'm a person who got involved in making maps. Maybe because we did make maps, I realized all of the sources of possible errors that could go into maps. You forget to put something on, you draw something in the wrong place, the data that you're using is out of date, or it's not including everything. There's many choices that have to be made when a map is made. So maybe one of the messages, just because something is on a map, just because it's in the newspaper doesn't mean it's right. You should be careful about what the source of the map is and what the limits are in terms of what you can draw conclusions from. Anyway, this was the geographer, so I kind of identified with that for some reason. I was trying to think of some characteristics of maps that summarize things. Maps they're kind of like left brain and right brain. I remember somebody saying to me that when you're playing an instrument, the piano or the guitar, Karen's here, Diane Walford's here, and Gord, musicians like that, when they're playing an instrument, it's one of the few activities apparently where we use both sides of our brain. So there's the logical, mechanical, physical skill of playing the instrument, right? There's the technical part of it. Is that the left brain? Forget which is which.
Left is logical.
Left is logical. So that's probably the left part of your brain.
Yeah.
But the other side of music is the emotional side. You know, when you play music, it's more than just the technical notes. What impression does it give you when you stand back and listen to it? What memories does it bring back to you? What feelings? So, in a way, maps are like that for me. There's a lot of science that goes into maps, especially now where we're using remote sensing for maps and we're using a lot of data sets from Statistics Canada and other sources. There's a lot of science and technology that goes into making maps now, but there's still the artistic side. When you look at a map, when you see a pattern on a map, that's a different part of your brain that you're using to get that overall lesson or impression or information from the map when you look at it. So it's art and science. There's a pattern usually in a map, and we learn from the pattern. And maps always involve choices, as we said before. Okay, so this is my experience with maps now. This is just Peter growing up.
Wow.
When I was a little guy, probably 8 or 10 years old, we would always drive, our family's from New Brunswick, so we would always drive to New Brunswick in the summer. It was a long drive in those days, and no seat belts and no air conditioning in the car. But Dad would always have highway maps in the car, but the old types of highway maps, right, paper maps. And Dad was an engineer, so he had a slide rule. For some reason, I was fascinated by my dad's slide rule. I don't know why. And you might think small things satisfy small brains, maybe, I don't know. When he was driving in the front there, I had a little map in the back, the highway map, and I would figure out how far it was from one town to another. And I think I must have timed it on my watch. Then I'd use the slide rule to calculate what our average speed was. Why I did that, I don't know. But that was my first experience with maps. And I'm sure my dad was always very patient, and he'd say, oh, that's very interesting, Peter. I'm sure Dad in his own mind thought, this isn't helping me at all. he knew the way so well, he was so good with directions naturally that he didn't need the map to go to New Brunswick, he knew the way, but he humored me and he let me get some experience with maps that way. That's a typical map in those days, so paper map, you can't see all the detail there. This is, Marcia goes down to Pennsylvania, so I don't know if that's part of the way she would go, but we would go from across at Cornwall into the States into northern New York State and then Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine, and down to New Brunswick that way. So on the old highway maps, they'd always mark the distances between the two little cities or towns, so that's what we would use. This is kind of a history and also modern mapping. This is Google Maps, and it happens to be a location in New Brunswick where our cottage is, my grandparents' cottage. And so when I was little, we had a little sailboat at the cottage, and Dad and I would go out with the sailboat. And one summer, a bathymetric chart showed up. Does anybody know what a bathymetric map is? What it shows on a bathymetric chart or a marine chart?
Depth.
Shows the depths, shows the water depths for the lake. So we had I don't have a chart here to show you, but we had a chart of this lake with the water depth. This was very interesting to me. And it was called Todd's Cove on the map, on this chart. We had never seen Todd's Cove on a map ever since. Todd was the name of my mom's family. So they had a farm here years ago. And at some point, some guy doing the bathymetric chart must have asked somebody, what do you call this cove? And he wrote Todd's Cove on the map. So my sister, last year, my sister doing some family history, and she said, I wonder if Google Maps would allow us to use Todd's Cove on the map. And she had to show them the evidence from the bathymetric chart that it was labeled there. If you go to that cove now in New Brunswick, you'll see Todd's Cove marked on the map. So I think that's a compliment to my sister,
Yes.
but it just shows you that they're open to updating maps if you have some information to support it. Yeah. When I was growing up, it was also the beginning of the space race. So astronauts were going up in rockets for the first time. And for me, the exciting part was when the astronauts would get out of a spacecraft tethered on a lifeline, and they'd be floating around in space and taking pictures. Well, when I was, I think, in grade 11 or 12, this picture came out. And I think it's called the Blue Earth, or there's some nickname for it, but it was the first time I had ever seen the Earth, not as a map, not as a globe. That was the real Earth. And it was, I don't know, it gives you a different, again, a different perspective, right? Seeing a picture like that. Why do you think it's called the blue map or the blue picture? I think it's called the blue map. No, the blue Earth. Blue Earth. You know, you think blue planet. How come? Why do they call it that?
Water.
Yeah, there's so much water. When you think of it, sometimes when we're preoccupied with maps of our country, you forget how much water there is on the Earth. But most of it is water. And even Canada, there was a fellow who we used to work with at Environment. He said in Canada, if you include the territorial waters, 1/3 of our territory is water. So when we're protecting things or thinking about our country, you have to think of not just the land, but also the oceans and the water. So that map did it for me, it showed me that. When I first started working, I got a job in the summer, maybe 18 or 19 years old. This is a survey camp in Newfoundland, in a small little place called Cowhead, which is a tiny community, fishing community on the west coast near Gross Morin Park. I'm so old, this is 50 years ago, but we were still camping, and you can't see it very well up in the top right corner. There's a survey instrument called a theodolite, and what that does, it measures angles. It's a fancy instrument for measuring angles, but people have been using theodolites for hundreds of years. The type of surveying we were doing that summer of '76, it could have been done 200 years before. So I got a taste of what it was like way back then. And what we were doing was actually watching the stars at night. So we had winter parkas on in the middle of the summer, and we'd be watching the stars. The theodolite would tell us when a star crossed the meridian, and when it did, we would mark that on an analog paper graph with some clock, and then we'd figure out our latitude and longitude from those measurements. It seems so antiquated these days. You'd never do that now. And the theodolites were heavy. They were heavy to carry up the hill. But I loved it because we were camping all summer. What better job could you get as a student than camping all summer? in doing helicopter work in the mountains. And then all of our calculations in those days were done with handwritten field books. And we did have calculators, hand calculators, but an awful lot of numbers and copying numbers. And when we get back to the office, we do more calculations. So that was the way surveying and mapping was done back then. This was about 50 years ago. That's Peter stretched out on the ground there. I don't know what I'm doing, maybe having some supper. Not sure. This picture is called Laundry Day. Middle of nowhere in Newfoundland along the south coast. You could never drive here. We had to go by helicopter. And we've got our laundry hung up between two survey tripods to dry out. But that's what it was like. There was hundreds of lakes and hills, and you were just camping out and getting positions. We were establishing what they called control points, which were kind of accurate positional markers that were in the ground, that the other surveys that would be run from there could base their position on those accurate control points. Just a little personal story. As we were packing up the helicopter to go back to the next place, there was 3 of us plus the pilot. We couldn't all fit in the helicopter, so they said, do any of you want to just stay behind with the last load of equipment? And I said, sure, I don't mind. So I stayed behind. It was going to be a couple of hours before they came back to get me. Nice day, I thought, I'm going to go for a little walk. Peter has a terrible sense of direction. Betty says the reason I got into mapping was I have a terrible sense of direction. I need maps. So I went for a little walk, and within 15 or 20 minutes, I had no idea where I was. I couldn't see the equipment that I'd left. Everything looked the same, and it just showed you how easily you could get disoriented. The helicopter pilot was an amazing person. He had a tremendous sense of direction. He could fix the helicopters. He could fly the helicopters. He found me. So that's why I'm here with you today. Otherwise, I'd still be in That's what the autolight looks like. This isn't a very good map. You'll see a better copy over there, but that's just a topo map. We started, Betty and I, and Linda's here. Yeah. We started to do some canoeing when I finished school and came back to Ottawa. Bon Echo was one of our favorite places, but the Gatineau as well. So we would get these paper topographic maps. I'm sure have you all seen those?
Yes.
Most people? At that time, they started making them out of Kevlar. Marsh and I were talking about canoes made out of Kevlar, but they started putting a covering on the map so it wouldn't get wet if you were canoeing. But we used those maps a lot, and with pretty good results. I mean, it helped a lot because they were great for showing where the hills were and where the lakes were and where the portages were. So I got used to some topographic maps. Incidentally, of course, you can still get paper topographic maps, but our daughter has a cottage up on the Quebec side near Cantley. Yeah. So when she got the cottage, I wanted to get her a topographic map of her cottage. So I went to the there's a great place called World of Maps. Has anybody been to World of Maps now? Great place. So I went to World of Maps to see if I get a map for Laura. And of course, her cottage was in the corner of the map. So I really wanted it in the center of the map. They said, no problem these days. We've got all the topographic maps scanned in their database there. So she's the person serving me said, you tell me where you want the cottage to be on the map and I'll create a map around it for you from this database. That's what she did, and she printed me out my custom topographic map for the cottage. So big step forward from when we were first doing our canoe trips. My first job, other than my summer job, which I really liked, the first job I had with, it was then called Energy Mines Resources, was with this fellow. Carl Gustafsson was one of the senior field engineers for the International Boundary Commission. And you might think this is funny, but the International Boundary Commission is responsible for maintaining the Canadian-American boundary. And you might say, well, that was surveyed years ago. Why would you still need people maintaining that boundary? Can you guess why? What would you have to do to maintain the boundary?
Trees?
Yes. Yes. A lot of sometimes the boundary is along height of land, and there isn't any trees, it's just a mountain range. But sometimes if it's along a forest, yeah, you have to keep it, there's a legal limit there. I think it's 66 feet or something like that. They have to keep that boundary cleared so it's visible. Somebody can stand on the boundary and look down the boundary. Carl was an amazing person. He'd been in the field for many, many years. So he'd been all over Canada, Alaska, Yukon, certainly all out west, down east. He just knew the field work so well. And this is a picture of him on the Wrangell Glacier, which is up on the Yukon-Alaska border, way, way up north. And although you think surveying is high-tech work sometimes, and today it is probably more so, what he's doing there is standing on a cliff edge with a tape, a measuring tape, and he probably has a field book there too, I'm not sure what else. But he was a tremendous person and a fascinating guy to work with. He just died a couple of years ago, but he would tell me stories. I never got a chance to go to these places with Carl, unfortunately. I didn't get a chance to go with him. But we were doing adjustments. We were taking the numbers from the surveys and trying to get rid of the errors and coming up with some better positions. So I was doing calculations with him in the office. It was kind of, you got tired of it after a while. Carl was a wonderful person to work with because whenever he saw me getting tired, he'd tell me a story. And he had so many stories about fieldwork. I really enjoyed that. This is an example. This is Google Maps again, I think, and it just an illustration of why it's good for some things but not good for everything. So if you wanted to find out where the closest McDonald's was or the Shoppers Drug Mart, as you know, Google Maps will probably show you where it is. It will show you how to get there, tell you what the traffic's like, how long it will take to walk. It's great. Say you type into Google Maps, show me the Mackenzie River. And that's what it shows you. And one point does not tell you very much about the Mackenzie River. But all that says is Google Maps wasn't designed to tell you about rivers and lakes and physical features. It was designed to tell you about road networks. So every map has its strengths and weaknesses. And that's, Google Maps was kind of weak at that. The reason I showed that slide, this was, I started to work after I worked at, with Boundary Commission, with the Atlas of Canada is a program that's been making atlases for Canada since 1906. But where I started with there was actually the Geographical Names Board, which is a fascinating group. It doesn't sound very exciting, but it's a group of people from every province and territory is represented. And so when they name a feature on a map in Canada, this group has to approve the name. And of course, they're interested in showing what the Mackenzie River looks like. So this was an example of what would happen if you typed in Mackenzie River in the Atlas page. You actually see a bit more detail about where it flows, and you go into more detailed maps for more information after that. But I wanted to mention here that, do you remember when the first Prime Minister Trudeau died, Pierre Trudeau? I think Jean Chrétien became Prime Minister later on, and he wanted to name Mount Logan. Mount Logan is up in the corner of the Yukon Territory. He wanted to name Mount Logan after Prime Minister Trudeau. So he made an application to the Names Board to name, he said, I want to name Mount Logan Mount Trudeau, in memory of Prime Minister Trudeau. Even though he was the Prime Minister, he did not have the right to do that, because it was the Geographical Names Board that had to approve it. And they studied it, and they discussed it, and they said, no, we think we should keep it Mount Logan because that's commemorating a very important geologist who helped discover large parts of Canada. So another example where mapping, it's important to know where the information came from, who made the decisions about the map. I found that a very interesting group that I work with. This is the little exercise that probably a little boy who was maybe 7 or 8 years old. He was the son of one of our colleagues. You can't see the details in the slide, but in French it's les accidents géographiques. Does anybody know what that means in French?
Geographic accidents.
But what does accident mean in French? There's another connotation to
Oh,
it.
really?
It's like landforms.
Oh.
Uh-huh.
So he's drawn, there's basically 3 different types of landforms that he's drawing. Depending on how he colors in the lake or the land, the circle could be an island or a lake, depending on how you color it in, right? The bay could be the bay or a point, depending on how you color it in. And this is an isthmus or a strait, depending on how you color it in. So it's a little kids exercise at school, but it shows you that maybe my biggest lesson from geographical names was geographical names are not an engineering exercise, they're not a technical exercise, they're a cultural exercise. The reason we name things, Mount Trudeau, Mount Logan, how big a definition of a lake is, it's all cultural. It's how the local people see that feature and how they name it. And so that's why the Names Board is really more of a cultural group, and they're not really into the physical definition. So That lake that you saw, Todd's Cove, that's on a lake in New Brunswick. It's called Washington White Lake. Our cottage is on a lake called Washington. It's not a lake. Technically, it's not a lake. It's just a widening of the river. But the local people call it a lake, so that's the name it gets. So you have to remember that when you look at names on maps. I found that interesting. I also worked in the geodetic survey for a while, and I was surprised to learn, this was the cover of a textbook I saw and it caught my attention. Do you know what that's showing there? Any idea? What those shapes are? They're the same thing from a different direction. One's from the side view, one's the top view.
Potato.
Then he says it looks like a potato. Yes, it does look like a potato. It's not a potato. Yeah, I'll give you a hint. It's distorted. I'm surprised nobody can guess. It starts with E. It's the Earth.
Oh my gosh.
It's distorted, but the Earth, the geodesists are very, very precise. The survey I worked with in the summer was measuring these precise positions. They're very, very concerned with details and precision. So they actually measure the size of the Earth and the shape of the Earth in great detail. If you blew up the distortions, the one at the bottom is, I think that symbol is for longitude, so you're looking at the Earth from the pole. That's what the Earth looks like, looking down from the pole, and the top one is the Earth looking at it from the side. So it looks a bit like a potato or a pear. As you might guess, it's not perfect. It's not a perfect shape. There's all kinds of reasons for, just like we're not perfect. Highly distorted. I'm going to just show you on the globe. I'll show you from over here. So this is a globe, of course. It's not highly distorted, so it looks like a perfect perfect sphere, right? And on this particular globe, if you look at it afterwards, you're going to see tiny little, what would you call them? Tiny little elevations shown on the globe. You can actually feel the texture changes where there are mountain ranges. So it's attempting to show where the hills are and the high mountains are in the Earth. This is highly generalized, but do you know how high the mountains would be if we showed them at their true height, even on this globe? Diane? You think we'd be even able to feel them? If the Earth was this size, even with Mount Everest, the Earth would be smoother than a billiard ball, smoother than the surface of a billiard ball. In other words, all of the elevations we see are minuscule compared with the size of the Earth. So they try to exaggerate it. This is often done with mapping. They exaggerate something on a map. They certainly exaggerate it on there. Not because that's the way it really is at that scale, but just to give you an idea that the Earth actually is not a sphere. And this gives you the idea that there is some elevation on the Earth. But actually the Earth as a ball, if we could see it from space, you'd never see those little mountains. Sorry for the interruption. The other thing I learned working in the geodetic survey was I just thought latitude and longitude were fixed, they were given. But latitude and longitude, because the Earth is not a perfect sphere, what they try to do is come up with the best fit. They use what's called an ellipsoid, which is like a distorted circle. They come up with an ellipsoid which fits the Earth, certain parts of the Earth fairly well. You can see that certain parts of the Earth would be a better fit than others. So they actually have different ellipsoids that fit different parts of the Earth. I'm getting too technical here, but latitude and longitude is all dependent on what kind of a shape they're assuming for the shape of the Earth, and it's always an approximation, because the Earth is really a little bit weird in its shape. Peter can't remember where.
Table.
I found that quite interesting about the geodetic survey. And they're so precise, they're getting, okay, we put those control points in the ground in Newfoundland 50 years ago. I forgot to tell you, but remember the slide about the camping trip where I was out in the tent there? Danny and I went back to that little village last summer, 50 years later, to see if it was still there. When we were there, was a fishing village, there was nothing there. But when we went back, there was a motel. And where we had put the survey marker was paved over with some kind of a, I don't know, astrolabe or a... Anyway, things had changed in 50 years. So our old survey marker wasn't there anymore. But with the geodetic survey, what's changed there, instead of putting physical markers in the ground, they have some, and now they're called active control points. So the markers that are in the ground are being constantly updated by the network of satellites. So surveying's really changed in those 50 years. People often ask me, do you understand how GPS works? And this is the simplest diagram I've seen that gives you an idea of how it works. It's a rubber duck in a little pool with 3 kids or 3 adults holding strings attached to the rubber duck. Think of the rubber duck is the position that the GPS is trying to locate. Okay? If you just think of it, if you just had one string, the rubber duck could go all over the place, right? If you had just 2 strings touching the rubber duck, it could flip on one side or the other side, depending on the distances. If you have 3 people holding onto it with strings, you've got a fix on its position. And highly simplified, that's what's happening with your GPS receiver. Your GPS receiver is like the rubber duck, and the 3 people around the pool are like the satellites, sending signals down to your receiver. Once you've got 3 satellites sending signals, it does some calculations and comes up with the position for you. That's essentially the idea behind it. Much more science involved in that, but it's not all that mysterious, really. What's amazing is how accurate they're now becoming, the GPS receivers. Even ones we can buy. Well, you probably don't even buy them. They might even come with the car now. So that's a change. Finally, I got a job with the Atlas Group, and what I wanted to say about this group is that the Canadians, for some reason, Canada started making atlases. I think we were almost the first country in the world. Maybe not the first, but I think Finland might have been ahead of us. But way back in 1906 was when the first atlas was made. And I have you'll see it afterwards, but there's a little, maybe I better just show you so you can see what the shape is. It's a very boring looking map, but and you'll never see it. You'll never see it from here because of the light. But it's a map of Canada in 1906, and thanks, Diane. Okay, it's a little better. I'll get an idea, but you'll have to see it afterwards. But in 1906, Newfoundland was not a province, so it was a colony of Britain. And Newfoundland and Labrador, Britain was making a certain claim about where Labrador should be, and Canada was making another claim. Canada wanted Labrador to be very small because they wanted Quebec to be bigger. Britain, who had Labrador as part of their colony, wanted it to be big. So this is the Canadian map. Labrador is very small. So you got to be careful who makes the map, is what I'm saying. And also in this one, you'll notice parts of Ontario were part of the Northwest Territories then, in 1906, and quite a bit of Quebec is too. So maps always have a timestamp, and you have to be careful when they were made because they will show quite a different story. So I'll leave that over there for you to take a look at if you want. Thanks, Diane. I forget where we put it.
Yeah, that's okay.
I'm starting to worry because the clock is still showing 5 to 1, and I'm sure it's not 5 to 1. So. And how am I doing, Bets?
I can't see what the
138. 138? Okay. Quick story about this map, you'll see it over there too. When we first started digitizing the maps of Canada, we had these paper maps. And we found that we were trying to come up with what map projection they used. And they told us what, thanks James, they told us what projection was used for the main part of the map, but we were having trouble with the north. It wasn't fitting properly. It wasn't the right shape. You know what it was? They had a certain sheet of paper that came off the press. They tried to get a map of Canada on that sheet of paper. Most of it fit. The northern islands didn't quite fit, so they crunched them down. In the old paper maps, they just physically crunched them down and made a special exception up north. That's kind of funny. This is a map of Canadian watersheds. It's a different way of looking at Canada, and some people say it would be better if our provinces were watersheds rather than just administrative, because a lot of things happen in a watershed environmentally. This is a friend of ours from work. His name is Derek McGarry. And one of the things I loved about working in the Atlas was we had such a variety of people that had to come together to make a map. Derek he was actually a newspaper guy from England. He came to Canada and also was very, very good at artistic drafting. He drew the shaded relief on the maps. Do you know what shaded relief is? It's shades and colors that give you the impression of three-dimensional mountains on a paper map, on a flat map. So Derek would do these beautiful illustrations on the old paper maps. Here we're doing a digital map of the circumpolar regions, and we got Derek's old sketches that were done by hand, and we were able to integrate them onto the digital map. So he was retired by then, but he was very pleased that his artwork is still being included. That's the circumpolar map there. You can maybe see some of the artwork that was used to show the bathymetry underneath the oceans up north. It's not a clear picture. I didn't get a clear picture, but we decided to make that circumpolar map really big and to put it on the floor. And this was some kind of a celebration for the International Polar Year. Can you recognize the location there? Museum of Civilization, I think. So we made a big map on the floor so people could stand up and look at the map that way. Different way to interact with maps. Have you looked at? Is anybody rich enough to look at a $100 bill? I think the $100 bill has changed. This was 15, 20 years ago. The Mint came to us and they said, we'd like to put a map of Canada on the $100 bill, new $100 bill. They said, can you guys work with us on that map? So a couple of our cartographers worked on it. Can you see PEI on that map of Canada? If you look, I think I might have a enlargement of it, but PEI is there, but it looks rather large compared with. That's an enlargement. Maybe you can't tell if you don't look at PEI very often, but that PEI on that map is way too large compared with its physical size.
It's not close enough to New Brunswick either.
What's that, Brenda?
It's not close enough to New
It's not
Brunswick.
close enough to New Brunswick. So what happened was they asked, the Mint wasn't happy because when we did it at the true scale, PEI was disappearing. People were missing it on the $100 bill. They said, we cannot have a $100 bill of Canada that you can't see PEI on. So they said, enlarge it. We don't care what you do, make it bigger, move it out, make sure people can see the PEI sticker in Canada. So if you check your $100 bill, you might see a map of Canada with PEI on it. I found, does anybody play Risk or have heard of that game? Younger kids play Risk. Sometimes when they're making maps for games, something gets left off, depending on what map projection they use. This time, quite often, for some reason, New Zealand gets left off. So here's the map of the world in Risk where there's no New Zealand. Apparently it happens often enough that there's some government department in New Zealand that gets on these cases and tries to put New Zealand back in the map.
I don't think Newfoundland was there either.
Maybe not. You're right, Gord. You're right. So be careful when you see maps. They're not always complete. We had an election here recently. And at work, we used to be asked by Elections Canada to do maps for them, showing the results of the election. In the old days, the map would appear about a month later or 2 months later, after all the checks had been done with quality control. At one point, when I got there, it was kind of a neat time because we were changing from conventional to digital. So they said to us at one point, is there any way you could make a map next day for us after the election? And I remember the first time, it was before the internet, the first time they would actually, Elections Canada would be phoning us, somebody would tell us the results over the phone, somebody would write it down in a table, and then they would transfer it to the map to show the results of the map. Now, of course, it's done with digital files and much quicker. And this was a map made of the most recent election. So you see, I'm sure red is conservative, red is Liberal, blue is conservative, and probably orange is NDP. In looking at this map, you might not see right away who would have won. It's because of the map that's being used. Huge territory in Canada, Nunavut, has probably 1 or 2 seats. Even though it looks like a large part of the map, it's really a very, very small part of the overall vote. So, see if you recognize this map. That's a map of Canada too. We call it an isodemographic map. So the provinces have been shrunk to reflect their relative populations. So it looks like a very distorted map. You see a lot of population around Vancouver, a lot of population around Toronto and Southern Ontario. Look at the north. There's almost nothing there. But for the purposes of a map, which tries to show where was the election won or lost, this kind of map can sometimes be useful if people aren't too thrown off by the shape of it. But when they first started making isodemographic maps, have been around for a while, not just for election results, but whenever you're trying to map something based on population. The first time it was done by a guy called Lou Skoda, who had a mapping company out in Vancouver. Way before computers were being used, or the internet again, he actually took wires that were used for the boundaries of the Canadian provinces, and he had ball bearings in the wires, and he put the number of ball bearings he put in were reflecting the population. And then he tightened the wires around the ball bearings, and he came up with a map that looks like this. So it looks very strange, but it's another way of looking at the information. Isodemographic, it's called. Oh, this was a map of the team. Do you remember the referendum that was held in the Charlottetown Accord back in 1992? It's so long ago. We had to get a map out the next morning about that Charlottetown Accord, and this was the team that worked on it. We were just starting with digital mapping, so some of the people did it the conventional way. They did a conventional map with a printing press, and others of us did a digital map with a plot. And the idea was we were supposed to come up with the same thing in the end. It's fun. Betty and I were in Australia to visit Asher and his sister. And this was a map showing how many people, what percentage of people vote in different countries. The colors aren't coming out too well, but Canada's probably not bad. 60%, maybe 2/3 of people vote. You see how dark Australia is? Almost 100% of the people vote in Australian elections. Do you know why?
You have to.
You have to. There's no choice.
Well, of course.
If you don't vote in Australia, you get a fine.
How much, do you know?
Not that much. $20 or something like that.
It's embarrassing, I guess.
I guess I'm not sure, but their voting rates are always above 90%. And then some countries are not very high at all. There's another example of how maps can be used to show some kind of a trend. Also in Australia, I was surprised, but they do preferential voting. Do you know what that means? If you have 3 choices on the ballot, you actually mark 1, 2, 3. You have to give each of them an order. And then in the end, if nobody gets 50% of the votes, they take off the bottom candidate and reassign their votes to each person's second choice. So it's a different way of, and it's been going on in Australia since the end of the First World War. It's amazing. So again, another map that shows that kind of pattern. Oh, and you meet people when you do mapping. This is our Canada map at work. The fellow on the left, his name is Francisco Takaki. Can you guess where he came from with a name like Takaki?
Italy?
Not Italy.
Colombia?
No.
Japan?
Japan. His family was from Japan, but he never lived in Japan. He grew up in Mexico. Don't ask me why. During the Second World War, like in Canada, Japanese people in Mexico were sent off to camps or sent off to live with other Mexican families, so they weren't all together. And he went to live with the Mexican family, not named Takaki, but that family happened to have, I'm thinking of John Huber, but that family happened to have, the dad was a botanist. And Francisco, as a little boy, would go on the field trips with his adopted dad, and he became a PhD in botany. And he was head of the Mexican mapping organization. We did some maps. You'll see a North American map that we did with the 3 countries together. Such a nice person. But he spoke Spanish and not much English. I spoke English, not much Spanish. So we had trouble communicating until we realized we can both speak French a little bit. He had gone to school in France, I guess, and I had taken some French. So here we were talking about maps between Mexico and Canada. He's a Spanish-speaking person who talked in French. It kind of worked. He was a very nice person. He was very interested in my snowshoes. One year I made some snowshoes, and Mr. Takaki had never seen snowshoes before. Can you guess who this is? I'm sure you'll never guess. Pardon me? Close. Eratosthenes. Have you ever heard of Eratosthenes? way back in the 300 years before BC. He was maybe the first geographer. I'm going to have to shorten this, but he was smart enough way back then to know that the earth was round, or he thought the earth was round. All he did was he took the measurement of the angle of the sun at a well south of him. He knew the distance to the other well, and he waited until the sun was right above the well he was in his town. He measured that angle. From that, he calculated the distance around the earth. Believe it or not, 300 years BC, he came up with an answer that was within 1% of the value we use today. So he knew the earth was round. He very accurately calculated its circumference. 1,700 years later, Christopher Columbus is leaving from Europe, sailing to where he thinks is China. He has no idea how far it is. He doesn't believe this, I guess. Christopher Columbus ends up near Cuba. He thinks he's in China. He's so far off. And he never realized. He went back 3 times thinking he was going to China, when the answer had been done hundreds of years, over 1,000 years before. So we're not that good sometimes at sharing knowledge. I forget who this is. Oh yeah, John.
Newton.
No. John Harrison. Columbus was having big problems with longitude. He didn't know how far he'd gone. And because to measure longitude like we did that summer, you have to have a very accurate clock and know when the stars cross your meridian. On the boats are moving all around like this, and so they couldn't get a good time, good accurate time. A carpenter named John Harrison came up with a very good clock that would work at sea. And it was because of him, in 1750, that people could get good positions. Up until then, they were very, very wild positions longitude. This is a fascinating guy. If you ever get a chance to read more about him. Have you ever even heard his name? David Thompson? Have you?
Yeah.
Oh, good. Okay. He was, this is before Confederation. He grew up very, very poor in England. Dropped out of school at 14, got hired on with the Hudson's Bay Company. But he was very good at math, very interested in learning about surveying. He literally surveyed, it's something like 2/5 of the continent. I mean, he was mapping most of the Western Plains. He was mapping the Columbia River down to the Pacific. And this is on foot, bringing his own canoe, making canoes, camping, going through mountain passes in the wintertime, bugs, everything else. Fantastic person. He marries his wife, who was part Cree, she was a Métis person out west. He marries her when she was 13 years old. They had 13 kids. Five of the kids would come with him, and his wife would come with him on their trips when he was out surveying in the middle of nowhere. And she was a wonderful linguist. She could help a lot with the translations when he was talking to the local people. But he was just an amazing person. What he built, what he was able to map. Many people say he was the most amazing geographer we've ever seen in North America. He dies penniless. Penniless he lived down by Morrisburg, that part of his life. He became blind. He wanted to publish his memoirs. Couldn't write it after a certain point. He was almost unknown, not even enough money to buy a headstone. And years later, another geologist comes across some of his papers and says, this guy did some amazing mapping. So he resurrected his legacy, I guess, and so now he has a bit more of a history to his work. Amazing person. There's some of the mapping routes he did. I have to go through this quickly. It looks like a mass of boring lines, but this was a railway engineer. You might say that's not a map, but actually down the left-hand side is distance from Paris, France to other railway stations. Along the bottom axis is time, so each of those lines is a train route. By putting the lines on that map, he could see when the train started and left, how fast they were going by the slope, and the most important thing was, if the lines crossed, guess what that meant? So even though it seems like a very simple way of planning, apparently his technique is still used today with computers, but the same principles are used today in planning networks for transportation. One interesting story more recently, in 2016 I think, Singapore had a very strange problem with their subway system. Lots of trains, very modern and everything, all automated, but trains would all of a sudden stop. They wouldn't crash, they just all of a sudden stop working. They would examine the cars, nothing wrong with the cars mechanically. But this was happening over and over again. And they couldn't find anything wrong with it until they plotted it on a map like this. When they plotted it on a map like this, they found out it wasn't the car that was stopping that had the problem. It was one of the other trains that was giving out electronic signals that were wonky, and it was shutting down. It was giving some kind of a signal to the other cars and shutting them down. Until they used this very old plotting method this guy developed in the 1800s, they would never have found out what was wrong. Have to mention John Snow. John Snow was maybe I have a picture of him. That's John Snow. He was a doctor in England, in London in the 1850s. And James, you know this fellow, James? Henry Whitehead, I think his name was. He was the Anglican priest in the same parish as John Snow. Going the wrong way here. John was a medical doctor. He was trying to figure out what can we do about cholera. There were these cholera epidemics in London. They were killing thousands of people. And they didn't know what was causing it. They thought it was if people weren't very rich, if the people weren't very well, they didn't have very much money, or they couldn't keep themselves very clean. They thought it was being passed by, they were dirty, or they were breathing germs on other people. They couldn't track it down. John Snow is a medical doctor, but he makes a map. And his map is of those little boxes that are like what's it called? Not pie charts. Box diagrams or bar charts of the number of people who died. So down here, just to the left of that little red circle, there's a lot of people died in those tenement houses. Less as you go farther away from it. Two interesting exceptions. You see where it says workhouse? According to the theory at the time, if you're in a workhouse, you're poor and you're probably dirty. Those people should have been dying like flies. Hardly anybody died in the workhouse. Another place that should have been bad was the brewery. All kinds of people congregated working in the brewery. Nobody died in the brewery. John Snow does his map and he says, I think the problem is the pump, the water pump. Nobody thought it was related to water, but he realized that the concentration of the deaths were around the pump. Nobody would believe him. He went and physically took the handle off the pump so they couldn't use it. And all of a sudden, the deaths went down. He couldn't understand why, because they didn't have microscopes that were good enough at that time to see the bacteria. He didn't really know the mechanism, but he had this correlation between water, impure water, and deaths. The reason nobody died in the workhouse, you know why? Workhouse got its water from another pump. You know why nobody died in the brewery? They weren't drinking water in the brewery. There's the pump. If you go to London today, you'll still see John Snow's pump on that with the handle off. Without going into very much detail, long before Mount Everest was conquered, until they got to the top, they wanted to know how high it was. And even though it sounds simple, basically with triangles and angles and distances, if they measured the distance along the ground from where they were sighting to Mount Everest, and they measured the angle, they could calculate the height of Mount Everest quite accurately. Just like Eratosthenes years and years before. With Mount Everest, I think they were within 1 or 2% of the accurate height. Since then, of course, people are coming with GPSs and all the high-tech stuff, and they're getting very accurate results, but they're so accurate, it's probably not worth it because Mount Everest actually changes in height. There's things happening with the Earth crust that actually move mountains. So it's probably not worth trying to get too accurate.
Three cheers for mathematics.
Yes. Map projections. I forget what this one was. This is a Mercator. Be careful of what map projection you're looking at because it can distort the shapes or the angles or the sizes of countries. I think this is the Mercator projection, which was used because you could get very accurate directions for navigation. But look at the size of Antarctica. If you look at Antarctica on the globe, it's nowhere near that big compared with other. Look at the size of Greenland. It looks bigger than Africa. Greenland is 1/5 the size of Africa. So you've got to be careful of the map projection. Yes, I wanted to mention this to James too. James, this was a map projection called the Gauss-Peters projection. It attempts to correct some of those problems. Gauss was a Presbyterian minister from Edinburgh, I think. And he was somehow interested in cartography, so he came up with this projection, which was reinvented many years later. But can you guess who might have come up with this projection? Buckminster Fuller. He was the guy who had a geodesic dome. So it kind of looks to me like a geodesic dome, but you can see the continents are kind of distorted, different angles, but it's a way of taking apart some kind of a projection to show it in more accurate relative shapes and sizes. This is a much more modern map. I was really interested in this. Just before I retired, there was an exhibit at the National Research Council on mapping, new mapping. And we went over. This is not a geographical map at all. Can you tell what it's mapping? It's actually mapping subject matter. And so what it's showing is, so here for instance, social sciences, all those yellow dots are social sciences research papers. And here's some that are medical or earth sciences or math or chemistry. Can you guess what the lines are between the papers? When one person cites another paper. So I read Dale writes a paper on biology. I read I'm a math person, I read his paper and I think that's really interesting from a math point of view. I'm going to use Dale's research when I do my math write-up. What happened, and they animated this for us at the National Research Council. So what you saw was the blocks starting to appear on the map, and all of a sudden there'd be a shoot of a line across subjects. Normally they'd be all within one subject, right? Somebody would create a paper that referenced something else, and all of a sudden you see a whole bunch of lines start going back and forth. So it's really a map of how knowledge moves. And today with the internet, it's so easy to get access to information. So I found that a very interesting, different type of map. And of course, it's on a piece of paper, right, or flat. Of course, it's really a globe too. Math also joins up with social sciences on the other side of the map. I thought that was a neat way of another application of mapping. I like basketball. The NBA finals are on now. And in the first game of the finals, the team that won were the underdogs. They were behind in the game every step of the way until the very last basket. And they made the basket and won the game. So this is a game flow, they call it, but it's basically time versus points, showing the two teams. And the team that was the underdogs with the black line. So you can see they're getting a bit further away, then they get closer towards the end of the game, and then they win. Just shows you another way of looking at the game. I'm sure you've seen some of these, but on planes now there's wonderful maps. This was a map we were coming back from Australia, I guess. So that we were in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, I guess. You'll have to quickly tell them the story of the map on the plane, with the type of plane.
Forget all the details, but when we were sitting on the plane, there's always an information booklet about the plane in the seat in front of you. So I took mine out and was looking, and it said something like, this plane flies, I forget how many thousand kilometers, but say 1,500. And the map that we were looking at, how the plane goes over the ocean, was 2,000. And again, I'm just pulling numbers because I haven't got the information in my head or in front of me now. And I said, Peter, there's a problem. Are we going to have to get out and swim the last 500 meters? And so he said, well, that's interesting. No one's ever noticed this before. So I called the stewardess over. And I said, look, this map on the back of on the screen shows us this distance. The plane only goes this distance. So what happens? She said, oh my, I've never had to get out before. So then she went to the pilot. And the pilot looked at it, and I guess it startled him too. But then somebody noticed the brochure I was looking at was not the plane that we were in. It was another plane.
Thank goodness. Maps are really amazing on planes these days. The art and science part of maps, we learn from the patterns that we see, and there's always choices involved. I've already taken more time than I should have, but this is our grandson, and that's the first map he made. So he's got another map up on the wall that you can take a look at later, but really probably within 15 or 20 minutes he just went and drew it. So what I wanted to emphasize to you is we all, in our minds, make maps. When you're going home after this lunch today, you have a map in your head of how to get there. It might not be the same as my map. Some people's maps are a lot more detailed, a lot more accurate, but we all have and use maps. So what I'm going to do, let you have a chance to tell me about some of your maps, but I'm going to also, I would like to have 6 volunteers, 1 from each table. Would you like to know what it's for? Well, that too.
There he is.
If you have time, some people might have to go, but I was going to let 1 person at each table draw a map of how they got to school when they were little, when they were going to school. Would anybody like to try at this table?